Hello and welcome. My name is Rodney Hakim, and I welcome you to the New York Shakespeare Spotlight on Education series. As you know, the New York Shakespeare social media is dedicated to bringing you all the Shakespeare that we can find happening in and around New York City, whether that is theatrical productions, podcasts, book releases, film screenings, or whatever the case might be. But every fall, we like to take a step away from that and bring you into the world of Shakespeare education, hence the Spotlight on Education series. And we love within that series to speak with some of the primary scholars, writers, authors, and thinkers in the world of Shakespeare. This time around, we have certainly someone who qualifies for all of those categories. And we are speaking today with Carol Ann Lloyd, who is the author of two wonderful books relating to Shakespeare, the Shakespeare period, and that is Tutors by the Numbers, and that came out about a year ago and just released not so long ago is Courting the Virgin Queen. So hello, Carol Ann, and we welcome you to the New York Shakespeare social media.
Thank you. It is so fun to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
All right. So, Carol Ann, our mission is mostly to celebrate the things that are happening in New York, but you are not in New York. You are in Washington, D.C., where you are a historian, a writer, a speaker, and I think your speaking is very widespread. You do speaking at the Smithsonian, at I think it's the Royal Oak Foundation, and a number of other prestigious institutions.
Yes, in fact, I was just in New York, speaking of New York, last week, giving a talk for the Royal Oak Foundation. So it's always fun to go up to New York.
And I think not so long ago, you were visiting the Emerald Isle. You were in Ireland leading a
Yes,
Smithsonian tour over there, right?
that's right. I work with Smithsonian Journeys, and I was able to go to Ireland. It was fabulous this year. Yes.
Okay, all right. So Carol Ann also hosts a podcast discussing the all the things that are related to the world of Shakespeare, and that is called Rebels, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.
That's right. That's right.
All right,
Covers all of Shakespeare, right?
it's all that's pretty much if you have the three R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, you have the three R's: Royals, Rebels, and Romantics for Shakespeare, right?
Yes.
In addition to that, in addition to Carol's being a historian, a writer, a speaker, a leader of tours for the Smithsonian and various other endeavors, she also has launched a new series for her speaking, which it focuses on leadership and ties that into Shakespeare, notably some of the leaders who have the best speeches and the best leadership qualities of Shakespeare. But we will put a pin in that and come back to that in a little bit. So, Carol Ann, before we get into a discussion of your books, which are really, truly fantastic, and I highly recommend our audience to check these out, let us find out about you and who you are and how you got so deep into the world of Shakespeare and into the world of the Tudor family. So Carol Ann, what's your background? How did you get involved in Shakespeare in the first place?
Well, first, when I was quite young, I was watching television with my mom. We're big PBS fans in our family. And there was a BBC production of The Six Wives of Henry VIII, starring Keith Michelle as Henry VIII. And I got hooked on that. My mom was watching that, so we started watching together. And that led me to want to find out more about the Tudors in that period. Growing up, I grew up in Utah, and there is a wonderful Shakespeare Festival in Cedar City, Utah. So we went down to that, saw some Shakespeare plays, and between the history and the Shakespeare, I was hooked. I also had some wonderful history and Shakespeare teachers in high school and college. And, education is so often the heart of things, how you really are introduced and nurtured in your interest in this. And that was certainly the case with me. I had some wonderful Shakespeare in particular teachers that really made it come alive for me and let me know that these plays are just endless in what they can offer us.
So a lot of people that have that trajectory, I'm sorry, that the word doesn't want to come out of my mouth, that background of, they have the teachers in school that encourage them or light that fire in them, and then maybe in the Utah Shakespeare Festival, which is a great Shakespeare festival,
Yes.
and have that background. Sometimes that leads them into a path into performative Shakespeare. But for you, you went more into the academic world. What was that process for you?
That process, I did a master's degree in literature and then another master's degree in education. And I have worked in the corporate world in communication and leadership, sort of separate from my history and Shakespeare background. But a few years ago, I became a volunteer and then an employee at Folger Shakespeare Library here in DC, which is an absolutely magnificent, wonderful place, just reopened few months ago after extensive renovation. It is just wonderful place to see Shakespeare, learn about Shakespeare, experience Shakespeare. So I'm very closely associated. I'm not a full-time employee anymore, but I am a researcher there. And so I've continued to explore my love of Shakespeare and the history, and love visiting not only New York, but England, going to London as well, doing research at the British Library and the archives, going to Stratford. It's just a wonderful thing for me that really feeds my soul. And I just want to share with other people. So I started working on sharing Shakespeare and history.
Okay, all right, so that's fantastic, and of course the Folger Shakespeare Library, which you mentioned, it's a wonderful, wonderful institution. They have great podcasts, they have great content that they put out, but the actual building, the facility, as you mentioned, was undergoing a lengthy renovation. It just reopened not so long ago, and they have a new executive director, one of our recent colleagues that we spoke with, Farah Kareem Cooper. So that's a very, very big news. The tremor in the Shakespeare world.
Yes, to get her to come over, I know, was very exciting for the Folger. I worked with the previous director, Mike Whitmore, and the director of education, Peggy O'Brien, really closely, and it was a lot of excitement to know that Freem was coming over. So yeah, it's great days for the Folger. It's very exciting time.
Well, it's not just for the Folger. I think for Shakespeare scholarship in general, it seems like we're really at a renaissance, pardon the usage of the phrase, a renaissance in Shakespeare scholarship. I think at this point in time, we have more high-level Shakespeare academics and scholars working and disseminating their work than perhaps any time in history that I'm aware of.
And it's exciting. There are so many different ways of talking about Shakespeare. I am familiar and know quite well, actually, Cassidy Cash, who has the podcast That Shakespeare Life. She's wonderful about sharing all kinds of things about Shakespeare, as are you guys. I mean, it's just this wonderful way of learning in different environments. So you come to know Shakespeare not as some elitist, serious, you have to get dressed up to go see a play kind of experience, but you can experience and do experience Shakespeare in everyday life. And I think that's one of the things that's really exciting. It's becoming part of and known to be part of our everyday lives.
Absolutely, and I think that what you hit on that there, and Kathleen's a good friend, and she's fantastic. But as you mentioned, with Cassidy's podcast and with some of the other forms of dissemination of Shakespeare scholarship, podcasts, different kind of content on the internet in the past 4 or 5 years, and I think in many ways prompted by the coronavirus pandemic, that really exploded. And is that when, during the coronavirus pandemic, is that when your Royals, Rebels, and I'm looking at the third, all Romantics?
Yes.
Yes. That when the podcast came out?
Actually, that is when, it was quite an exciting time, that March 2020. And some of the speaking that I had been doing pretty much in person all sort of was changing. And a friend of mine who was traveling and doing some volunteer work said, "Oh, I miss talking to you. You know what, Carol Ann, you should start a podcast." And so I started sort of small with Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. That kind of covered the history and the Shakespeare, got everybody in there. And it has really grown and been really exciting. I'm now able to interview people. I've had a couple of really great Shakespeare scholars Darren Freebury Jones was on, Chris Lataris was on. I mean, I've had some really great people on lately, as well as historians of the period. So it's really been a great opportunity to, as you said, just share Shakespeare in all kinds of different ways in different venues. And of course, I've had Cassidy on as well. So
Yeah, and I've listened to some of those episodes, and it's really, really wonderful stuff. And you get into each episode is about half hour, 40 minutes, and you get into such nice, deep discussions with some of these scholars and academics. And sometimes people hear that, oh, it's going to be a discussion with scholars and academics, and it's going to be so dry and so boring. But really, it's really fun. And I think in particular your discussion with Darren Freebury Jones was
yeah.
really, really funny, entertaining. And I've talked to Darren before, and he's a really interesting guy. But I think with you, there was a certain level of disarmed charm and humor that was really fantastic. So, and you recently, congratulations to you. Your podcast recently passed the 200 episode mark.
Yes. So we're in our 5th year and just past 200 episodes. So it is exciting when you just don't know what's going to happen when you start, but it really has turned out to be so much fun. And I've met so many people. It's great.
And that's really great. And that's something else that if in prior days prior to the coronavirus pandemic, if things were more localized, if you were giving one of your discussions, one of your speaking events, it was a local event. It was at the Smithsonian, it was in New York City, it was in the UK, wherever it might have been. Now you can have your podcast and your blog and your YouTube channel and everything else that it's there for usage on demand. So I think it's a really, really wonderful way to increase the amount of Shakespeare scholarship that is not only being released, but that is present to you 24/7.
Yes, and it is great. In fact, I just signed up this afternoon for a couple of programs at the National Archives in the UK, and I've been able to watch online things from the Shakespeare Institute. So you really are able to do so much more now that a lot of things are online. It is really great and exciting.
Okay, so let's get into your 2 books, which are wonderful, wonderful. The first one came about a year and a half ago, and that was Tutors by the Numbers. And then that's followed up just not so long ago, maybe about a month or so ago, by your new release, Courting the Virgin Queen. And we were speaking a little bit before we started the recording, and you mentioned that you were researching these 2 books together, which might be why the 2 of them didn't get released so far apart. How many years of research went into all that?
Well, I've been trying to learn more and more about the Tudors, as long as I can remember. And so I started researching, a little more seriously and realizing that although I'm not affiliated full-time with the university, I could access files at the Folger Shakespeare Library and at the British Library and at the National Archives. And so as I started working with the original documents, I discovered, 2 or 3 years ago, there is just so much power in seeing the actual document. So when I was looking at the relationship for Tutors by the Numbers, and one of the numbers is we have these 2 regnant queens, the first 2 regnant queens, Mary the First and Elizabeth the First. And what's their relationship, together? They had sort of a very complicated relationship. And there's one letter that Elizabeth, as princess, wrote to her sister, who was the queen. Elizabeth was under suspicion. She was the wrong religion, and Mary wasn't really sure she could trust her. So Elizabeth is writing this letter to gain or regain her sister's understanding and support. She's not successful, but she's trying. She's also trying to take long enough to write the letter that they miss the tide to go to the Tower of London, which is why it's called the Tide Letter. And you can read the transcript of that letter where Elizabeth is telling her sister, I'm your loyal subject. But when you see the letter itself, you can see that when Elizabeth has said all she needs to say, she then draws lines through the blank page so no one else could fill something in incriminating her or something rude or snarky or whatever that might get her into trouble. And the actual document, you can see how she has scored the page. And that is very powerful to think of this young woman I think she was 23 at the time, having the presence of mind to do that. And to see how that, if you just read the transcript of the letter, which is very interesting as well, but when you see the lines or when you see one of the speeches of Elizabeth or of Mary or some of these others who are giving these speeches, and you see the crossouts in their own hand as they're creating these famous words that we have recorded, it's really quite amazing. So as I'm doing this kind of research for the two books, and they did inform each other, they're both about the Tudors, it really was fun to sort of discover the personalities that come through when you see the actual documents.
And that's I have to tell you, I've read a lot of things about the Tudors. I've watched all the the Elizabeth, the many Elizabeth movies and the series. It seems like there's such a fascination with the Tudors and Henry VIII in particular, but also Elizabeth I. And there's so much media dedicated to them, films, TV series. But I don't think I've ever seen as thorough an encapsulation of what the life of the Tudor family was like as I've seen in your books, which is really magnificent. So why don't you give us just a quick synopsis of the transition from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, because it's really fascinating. You mentioned, and I'll let you do that first, but then we'll also come back to the parentage between Henry and the six wives and how Elizabeth fits into that. But why don't you give us that synopsis of how the transition happens?
So Henry VIII, of course, was not intended to be the second Tudor king. Henry VII takes the throne after he defeats Richard III, the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. And a year after he marries Elizabeth of York, he has a son named Arthur. And part of the Tudor mythology and the Tudor narrative was based on the return or the second coming of King Arthur. Henry was the second son. He was the spare. But Arthur dies young after he marries Catherine of Aragon. And so Henry VIII becomes King of England in 1509. He's not quite 18 years old. And he goes from being this very athletic, fit young man to being the man that we've sometimes seen this, I'm sorry about my cat visiting, this quite overweight, obese man at the end of his reign, really in bad health. And when he dies, in 1547, his young son, only 9 at the time, Edward, becomes the king. Edward VI. He is very young, so he has a council and he has a Lord Protector. And he has fully embraced, as have the adults around him, the Reformed religion. We sometimes refer to it as Protestantism, Anglican. I mean, all those terms have totally different meanings now. But the Reformed religion really is pushed forward by Edward. He is committed to getting rid of all vestiges of Catholic religion or the old religion. Well, when Edward becomes ill, in the end of 1552, he begins to sort of consider he hasn't gotten married yet. He's only 16. He doesn't have kids. What am I going to do? And he creates an idea of leaving the throne to the male heir of somebody, because there aren't a lot of men around who could take the throne. The Tudor claim to the throne was a little iffy, and so they had tended to get rid of the men who might challenge them for the throne. So Edward's looking at, what if I die without a child? All these men have been executed or have fled. So he leaves the throne, or attempts to leave the throne, to the male heirs, and then when death becomes more imminent, to Lady Jane Grey and her male heirs. And most people, interestingly, most people in Europe, when you look at the communication, believed that Jane Grey would be the next monarch. But Mary I is convinced that that throne belongs to her, and in only 13 days, she is proclaimed Queen of England. So the throne doesn't, I mean, it passes to Jane for those 13 days and then to Mary. Mary reigns almost 5 years and returns the country to Catholicism, does her best to return the country to Catholicism. Marries Philip, who becomes the King of Spain, and they try and get reconnected to the Holy Roman Empire and to the Pope and Catholicism. Doesn't quite finish the job. Mary, unfortunately, despite her best efforts, dies without children and kind of has no option but to leave the throne to her half-sister Elizabeth, who again brings the country into the Reformed religion, does not go as far as her brother. But in 1558, Elizabeth takes the throne and she rules until 1603.
Okay.
So,
And just the fact that Elizabeth is able to become queen is something that you explore in a really fascinating way in your current book, Courting the Virgin Queen, because you discuss the fact that even as young as 3, she is being maligned, and there's the fake news, so to speak, or the spin that's being put on her to indicate that she is a bastard child or that she's illegitimate. All different ways to distance her and make sure that she is not going to be considered a successor to the throne. And I'm sure this has a lot to do with the 6 queens. She is the daughter of the first queen, Anne Boleyn. And by the end, by the time Catherine Parr is the wife of Henry VIII, she is almost like a second daughter to Catherine, and they become a very odd blended family.
yes, and Catherine Parr was really a wonderful stepmother to all 3 of Henry's children. She was very warm. She brought and encouraged Henry to allow both daughters to be at court together at different times. She was a very warm stepmother to Edward as well as he was preparing to be king. So Catherine Parr really was a great influence on both Mary and Elizabeth. Everyone sort of expected Edward to take the throne. He was not an unhealthy child. He got sick and died sadly, but it wasn't like he was always unhealthy. Everybody thought he'd grow up and get married and have kids. And these 2 sisters, half sisters of his, were just kind of sidelined. But Catherine Parr was a great mentor of queenship to both Elizabeth and Mary. When Henry went abroad late in his reign on his sort of last attempt to conquer France, he left Catherine Parr as regent. And so Elizabeth and Mary were able to see their stepmother rule in their father's stead, but Catherine was a very active regent. And so they both saw this example of queenship that I think really helped them both when they became queen.
And something else that's really interesting in your book is your discussion of what young Elizabeth observes with Catherine Parr in her marital relationships or her romantic relationships, where there's more of a loving, caring environment than she had previously seen under Henry and the previous mothers or stepmothers.
Yes. And it wasn't, I mean, it could not have been easy for Catherine Parr to become Henry's wife. I mean, he had executed 2 wives. He had put one aside. He'd actually put 2 aside by that point. I mean, he was not a great husband. And yet, Catherine Parr came in and really, there was a dangerous time for her when she was accused of heresy, but she was able to keep the king on side and continue to be in his favor, which was necessary, which allowed her, yes, to create a much more loving environment for the children, a much more secure time for them.
So after Edward has his brief reign and passes away, and Mary has her brief reign and passes away, the only child left is Elizabeth. But Catherine is still alive at this time, right?
No, Catherine actually dies much earlier. Catherine Parr dies during Edward's reign.
Okay.
So interestingly, the one wife who lives into Mary's reign, if we're thinking about the 6 wives, it's Anne of Cleves, who had the shortest marriage to Henry VIII, only 6 months. But because she agreed to the annulment of that marriage so readily, she was given the title of the king's sister while Henry VIII lived and palaces to live in. And she actually was very friendly with Mary and Elizabeth and stayed in England and lived right into Mary I's reign and is the only wife buried in Westminster Abbey. So shortest reign, maybe best burial spot. I don't know, but it's pretty fancy to be buried in Westminster Abbey.
right? So the idea that Elizabeth carries into queenship as the only adult female at that point in time to become queen and to maintain her status as queen without being married. So I'm sure as you chronicle in some of the different things that happened, that she has different suitors and
Mhm.
all pressure from many different directions as to who should be the one that should be the consort or the king to go along with her. How does she ultimately find her and navigate her way through all that?
Well, it's really interesting because it is something that we would all consider, and even the royals today, I think, would consider a personal question of who you are going to marry if you choose to do so. But for her, it was very political, and the choices available to her were very political, and the reasons to marry were pretty political. And yet, she expressed early in her life, and certainly early in her reign, she had some desire to remain single. Now, she also expressed that she would, of course, get married because she knew that was her duty. So she said both things, but nobody took her seriously when she said she wanted to remain single. I think they should have probably, but she had to as she was turning down these very political relationships, including an offer from Philip of Spain, the husband of her sister who had passed away. Sort of ironic there. But she had to keep these suitors happy in having rejected them. She didn't want to make any enemies. They represented not just themselves and hurt feelings, but a country or an empire or whatever with power and an army, possibly. And in England, there were a couple of English suitors that she also needed to keep all of the court and the nobility on her side. So it was quite a dance to step through all of that, keep people happy as long as possible. Eventually, Philip did. That same Philip who'd wanted to marry her launched a war against her and sent the Armada. But think that's 30 years later. So for 30 years, she's kept that at bay, also keeping France at bay and Austria and some of those other countries. So it was strategic. She said just enough to keep them happy, but to let them know she was not actually going to marry them. It's really fantastic. And I do think some of that, we see a couple of places where she had said something. And of course, we don't have a record or a television reel of her saying these, but she was the queen. People did write down what she said. So we do have some records of phrases like, if it please me, or the idea of the woman choosing the husband that I think do show up in Shakespeare's plays. And when he is writing in the 90s, we see some characters like Beatrice and Much Ado who are choosing their husbands. Helena and Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream, they are choosing their husbands. They want to marry the person they want to marry. And so I think we see that Shakespeare does reflect, he has a sense of whether he believed it was the right thing or whether Elizabeth believed it was the right thing for all women. He had to get past the censor and make things, the right work to get it on the stage. And I think some of these women who are being quite deliberate about their marriage choices is a reflection of Elizabeth that we do see in Shakespeare.
That's a great point. And there's so much great text and so many wonderful ideas that are fleshed out in your book. I highly recommend our audience check out Carol Ann's book, Courting the Virgin Queen, and also go along with it 2 for 1. Get the Tutors by the Numbers. It's a great compilation. And there are so many more questions I want to ask you, Carol Ann, but we're running out of time, so I will have to bid you adieu. But I highly encourage our audience, again, pick up the books from Carol Ann, check out her podcast, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, which is a wonderful series. It is, I think it's episode 202 now. It's past the
Yes.
200 mark.
Yes.
And you can check out her website. Where can they go to find you, Carol Ann?
It's really easy. CarolAnnLloyd.com.
Okay, you can find
Easy
her
to
in there,
find.
and you can also find her at Shake Up History at on Instagram and Facebook and elsewhere. Carol Ann, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and giving us a glimpse into your wonderful work with the tutors and everything else that you're doing. And people can reach out to you for their for speaking engagements, for leadership discussions. I think you have a great video that points out the leadership qualities of a certain young man named Henry, which
Yes.
who
Not
she
Henry VIII, though.
not really another Henry. That's just for your books. But absolutely, people should check her out. CarolAnnLloyd.com. Shake Up History on social media. Carol Ann, thank you so much for joining us today, and
Thank
we look
you.
forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much.